Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu and we will answer them at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Manitoba Agriculture YouTube channel shortly after broadcast. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Crop Talk for August the 14th. And as we get into the middle of August here, we're definitely getting into harvest. And with that, I thought it'd be a good idea to maybe take a look at the canola crop out there, one of kind of our major crops that's growing, and look at some of how it's doing and get maybe an update as to what it's looking at like across the prairies, and talk a bit about some of the things that are happening in the field, and then looking at something that's going to be important this year is the pre-harvest or swathing. So we are lucky to have Angela Brackenreid on this morning, and she's an agronomy specialist with the Canola Council of Canada, and she's going to go through a talk on the canola crop and give us some tips for harvest. So I guess with that, I'll let Lori turn the screen over to Angela, and we'll get started.
Okay, right on. Thanks, Lionel. This is really timely. I'm glad that I have the opportunity to get on and talk about this morning. So as he said, first we'll just do a little bit of a general canola update across the prairies, talk about some of the notable disease and insects I've been hearing about lately. Want to get a bit more into clubroot. And then we'll switch gears and talk about swathing and pre-harvest and try and address what we can do and how we can try and manage some of the uneven crops and variance in maturity that we're seeing. So this is actually a map of the agronomy specialist with the Canola Council, but I'm using it to kind of guide myself through a bit of a crop update, because I know these regions based on my colleagues that live and work there. So as we basically, with the exception of Manitoba, as we move north and west, it starts to get wetter. So particularly as we start, I don't know, I'm hoping that you're seeing my mouse as I move it, but as we're here in like the North Battleford area and move kind of on an angle to the north and to the west up into the Peace River region, they've had really unseasonably cool and wet weather as of the last 2, maybe even 3 weeks. And that's had a big impact on crop development. Actually, even as far down as kind of the central part of Alberta, that's been the case. And my colleague Keith Gabbert was saying that he feels the crops are at least 2 weeks behind there. Kind of hard to imagine that he figures a lot of the crop he looks at is still flowering. And on the weekend up in this Peace River region, they had temperatures dip below 0. It sounds like we probably dodged a bullet and didn't have a lot of injury from that, but definitely some aborted flowers, and we'll see some pod abortion from that. But it's even here at home, it's a little nerve-wracking when we get these single-digit temperatures that are approaching 0 on August 14th. As you move into southern Alberta, it's I mean, not unusual for this area, but it's quite dry, and we're really into kind of year 3 of really dry conditions for that area. So the irrigated land sounds like still has some good potential, but the dry land is looking quite poor. Saskatchewan's a bit of a mixed bag, really hard to get a handle on it. The eastern part of the province is looking a lot more like the western part of Manitoba, and you see kind of more variation from north to south than anything. So similar to Manitoba, the more northern regions are a little on the drier side and further behind than what we're dealing with here, kind of in the southwestern part of Manitoba. Then you move east in Manitoba, and particularly in here in the Red River Valley, they've been quite dry. Then we, get over into I guess you'd call it Eastern Manitoba, and things look pretty good again. You know, around Steinbach, they had kind of what we had in around Brandon, where they were getting just some nice rains kind of every week, and the crop looks fairly good because of it. Interlake has been quite dry as well, and seeing some of the results of that. So I would say that in Manitoba anyways, it's a little bit of a mixed bag depending on how dry those regions were. We'll take a little bit of a closer look at some weather maps here from Ag Canada, so these are just precipitation percentiles, just looking at where precipitation is as relative to normal. So just as I was saying, you can see up in this Edmonton area in the more northern latitudes of Alberta, they've had up to exceptionally high amounts of precipitation. And then as we, well, I guess the southern part of Alberta actually looks a lot more like some of the more northern parts of Manitoba. So a little bit weird for us, I think, in Manitoba to be the drier province in the prairies. Particularly weird for these folks in the Red River Valley that are not accustomed to being this dry. I would say from what I've seen in the Westman area and southwestern parts of Manitoba, we've got some pretty good yield potential there. I think rather than be super optimistic and be disappointed, I'll say we've got at least an average crop, and let's hope for better. This is what makes me a little nervous when we look at soil moisture. Even though, you know, in parts of Manitoba, we've had some rains that have kept this crop going and really gave us a decent looking crop for the most part. We're still certainly in a moisture deficit, and you can see that when you drive around and look at sloughs and see that you know, a lot of the rivers in the province are dry and not running at all. So that's certainly makes me nervous as we think about, you know, next year's potential and what we're going to be going into the winter with. And then, as I was referencing, temperatures have been a little cool overnight. Even our daytime highs the last week have been on the cooler side, and I kind of hope that this trend doesn't continue. I mean, cooler temperatures are nice as we get into swath timing for maybe a bit of slower curing, but it's definitely slowed that crop progression quite a bit, and you know, we're seeing some canola that I would have expected would be further along in seed color change, that even the outer part of the plant looks more advanced than it is when you actually get in and start opening up pods. So that's all on kind of the general crop update and weather update. When we look at disease and insects, I just picked a couple here that have been notable in the last week. So just yesterday, I got a few questions about late season flea beetles. We see this every year. Tends to be concentrated, you know, along headlands or in areas where the crop isn't as advanced, and there's some green vegetative material they can still latch onto, or pod material that's not as leathery or rubbery yet. It is very rarely economical. The little bit of work that we have on it would suggest that we need at least 100 per plant to be economical. Some of the concerns with this, though, is pod shatter, really. So if you've got a lot of flea beetle feeding on pods, that they'll potentially make that pod prematurely shatter. If the pod is mature enough that it's fairly leathery and rubbery still, that's not really that likely. The other concern, though, would be that they, you know, even if the pod doesn't shatter, they get through some of that material and can cause the seeds inside to shrivel up. So I would say though that if the seed is physiologically mature, so if it's firm to roll, it should be safe from that. So general messages, probably don't need to worry about it, but I've seen once an extreme case where we did need to spray. So I wouldn't say that we should just be turning a blind eye to it. Grasshoppers continue to be a story, really in all crops, and tend to be more damaging in crops other than canola. It's really tough to assess thresholds of grasshoppers. We have a nominal threshold of 8 to 12 per square meter. It's kind of like a walk and see how many jump in front of you and try and quickly count as they're jumping. But again, usually not economical, usually more concentrated along the headlands. Sclerotinia now, obviously not a management thing at this point, but this is kind of the point where we can start to assess, should we have sprayed or did we need to spray, or how bad is this disease? And it certainly seems to be following the moisture. I know my colleagues in those areas I was talking about that have been more wet, they had quite a few people didn't spray because at the time the pressure didn't seem that high. And then we had fairly late infection that's actually does appear to be, potentially economical. From what I've seen so far, I would say that Manitoba levels are generally low. Although an old colleague of mine sent me this yesterday and said, oh boy, I think we maybe should have been spraying. And I was a little surprised to see that. It just kind of depends what stage was that crop at when all of a sudden we did see more, conditions conducive to disease development. Lionel had asked that I talk a little bit about clubroot, and I think this is pretty timely, actually, as we can, this would be about the time that symptoms become a little bit more obvious if you do have clubroot on your farm. When we look across the prairies, these are the 3 prairie maps of clubroot, and they describe them differently. So we can't really compare apples to apples here. The bottoms of the map kind of show the gradient of, maybe less severe to severe on each one. So you can tell, unfortunately the colors don't necessarily line up, but you can see if you look at the bottom, what it means. So for example, in Alberta, as you move from green to red, it's either not there at all or there in very low numbers to there in very high concentration once it gets red. So, red around that epicenter around Edmonton. In Manitoba, we do it differently than the other 2 provinces. We mark our map based on concentration. So these are soil samples, and they can tell how many grams of clubroot spore, or how many spores per gram of soil, sorry. Either not there at all at the green level to very low concentrations to once it's in the red gradient, either we found symptoms or the spore concentration is over 80,000 spores per gram of soil. So I'm fairly convinced that the more surveying we do, the more we'll just find that we have clubroot in every RM in Manitoba, and that's really becoming true. Maybe not in super high concentrations, but it's there. So about now and, at around that swath timing is a good time to be pulling plants and looking for symptoms on the root. So you need to actually pull it up. Usually, as long as the disease hasn't progressed too much, we can just pull them, or, as long as there's decent soil moisture there and we can actually get the roots up, we can just pull them out. Once the disease progresses, excuse me, sorry, it will, those galls will disintegrate and slough off. So they do kind of warn that you may pull it and not see the galls. But even, those, in those cases where I've seen that, you would notice that something is strange about those roots. So I just want to make note that hopefully if we're going to see clubroot symptoms, that we see them like this, and it's pretty inconspicuous. You may not even notice this, and you certainly won't see any above ground symptoms when you have the disease at this level. So you can see just small little swellings on the roots on both these plants. Then, maybe a little later in the disease infection, a little higher concentrations, we might see things like this, and quick drive-by, and you'd say, oh, there's a sclerotinia patch, or there's a sand ridge, and it's ripening prematurely. Most of our diseases will cause this to a certain degree, so really need to actually get out and pull those roots. In this case, that's in fact what it was. It was clubroot that was choking off moisture and nutrients to that plant. There are areas that I would suggest are higher risk. So, if you have areas of high traffic, that certainly could be higher risk. But any areas in the field that have moisture going to them or tend to pool moisture can be higher risk areas, and we should be trying to focus our efforts there. Most of our crop is past this stage already, but if we have severe infection and very high spore concentrations, we can see symptoms set in much earlier. And you can see in this case, we've got severely stunted plants, some plants that are missing altogether, and a pretty obvious patch. This is way too late. Well, I would suggest that the picture before is too late as well, but we've got very high concentrations in the field if we don't catch it until this point. So I would suggest that if you or your customers are not currently growing clubroot resistant varieties, you really need to seriously consider it for next year. We really need to be implementing some management before we find symptoms like this. And unfortunately, we have seen symptoms like this in Manitoba and worse. And so we know, we're at spore concentrations well over 1 million per gram of soil, and it's going to take some pretty serious management to try and reconcile that. When I first started with the Canola Council, that was now 7 years ago, we talked about how great of an opportunity Manitoba had to kind of learn from Alberta, who didn't know much when it first arrived in 2003, and we've spent millions of dollars and a lot of resources trying to understand this disease. So here we had this opportunity to be proactive. I would suggest that from what I've seen, we haven't done a very good job of that. We're already seeing, different pathotypes and severe symptoms like this, and it'll quickly get ahead of us if we don't start trying to do something about it. So, like I said, looking at clubroot resistance for your farm for next year, extending rotation, make sure we're scouting. And if we have severe areas like this, I'm not going to get into it, but we have some patch management protocols that can try and quarantine and get those symptoms lower in those patches. But in the time being, definitely get off the swather and pull plants or off the sprayer or whatever, whatever that might be, and take a look at those roots. We can also send soil samples into the Manitoba Pest Lab. Every sample is $125, but Manitoba Canola Growers has a program going right now where if you're a member of Manitoba Canola Growers, so you pay a check off, you can get a free blackleg, glyphosate resistant kochia test and clubroot test. So I'd really encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. So that's my little soapbox about clubroot. We'll get now into what might be fairly timely for some producers is how we manage uneven maturity. And unfortunately, I don't have a cut and dry answer here, but I think one of the easiest things that we can do is just let that crop stand. And that would apply mostly if you're growing varieties that have a level of pod shatter tolerance. So you can see in this work here, basically they were targeting a 10% moisture cut, and then they imposed a 3-week delay to see what losses were like. And so we've got some pretty significant losses with a lot of these varieties. first pod shatter variety on the market essentially had no losses at all. So I think we're all fairly convinced of what that pod shatter tolerance can do for us. But it certainly can be nerve wracking when you're letting it stand, weeks or days beyond when it's actually ready to go. But it does buy us that time and let us do that. So let those least mature areas catch up. Other nice thing about straight cutting is we can cut out those really immature areas if we want to and get rolling on maybe some of the higher areas of the field. If we're looking to swathing, either those pod shatter varieties or our standard varieties, what we at least want to see when we have uneven maturity is at least some seed color change on the very bottom of the main stem. And when we're talking seed color change, I'm not meaning that that they're completely black or brown in color. I mean that you at least see some speckling on those seeds. Now, that's not the ideal seed color change for swathing, obviously, but I know I've seen some pretty extreme variance in maturity, and to try and keep the more mature areas from shattering, there's definitely a compromise that needs to be made, and I would suggest that that's probably the best one to make that would incur the least amount of yield or quality losses. If the maturity difference is even more extreme than that, then we at least want to see that those seeds are firm to roll, so physiologically mature, and that we don't have any mushy or translucent seeds. So check the main stem, but also check those outer branches and make sure you're not seeing that. And then try and take advantage of moisture either late at in the day, getting into the evening, or early in the morning, or on a day when there's a lot of dew or some rain, and swath at that time. Try and slow that initial curing process, and the yield losses are actually surprisingly not that high in those cases. Where you will certainly see high yield losses is when you swath this early, and then it's followed by hot and dry weather. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the pre-harvest aid options we have and how they may or may not be used for managing maturity. I think the other thing that's kind of top of mind for me as we look back on the past couple of years is when we get into the field, we've had, I hate to even say it, I don't want to jinx anyone, but we've had some early arrivals of winter, and I know a lot of people have been thinking about which harvest method can they use to get into the field the fastest. So this is some work that from PAMI from I think this was a couple years ago now. They've done this again. It's been replicated again over a couple years, but looking at different pre-harvest aids or naturally ripened straight cut or swathed, and the days from plant till harvest. So really from this work, the heat and glyphosate, naturally ripened and swathed, kind of all ended up being harvested right around the same time. The Raglone treatments were harvested 10 to 11 days sooner. So Raglone, being a desiccant contact herbicide, dries that material down really, really quick, and it's kind of like clockwork. But we'll talk a little bit more. So I mean, that sounds great if that's your goal, is to get in early, but we'll talk a little more about how we need to be kind of careful with that product. It does seem that if we swath on the early side, we can get that crop to move maybe a little bit faster. But again, we got to be pretty careful with what conditions are like after that swathing operation, or we can see some pretty big yield losses. So the timing for Raglone is 90% brown seed. That is not a seed color change reference. That's when we talk brown seed, we're talking completely turned black or brown in color. And so at 90%, you basically only see the top outermost seeds that aren't completely brown or black in color. So that crop is pretty much mature when you spray this product. So we certainly don't want to be using a product like this to manage variance in maturity. If we have any variation at all and we spray Reglone, we can definitely see, you know, locking in some green seed and some quality issues. Heat, 60 to 80% seed color change. BASF is recommending producers try and target the later end of that stage at 80% seed color change. So that's a main stem measurement, not nearly as advanced as what Reglone would be. Heat can maybe be used a little bit more effectively for managing variance in maturity because it has a mix of kind of contact and systemic activity, not nearly as fast acting as Reglone is. Still, though, we need to be careful. We want to make sure that that the least mature areas of the field are at least kind of at that swath timing stage before we would apply a product like that. Glyphosate, the main use for glyphosate still remains pre-harvest perennial weed control. In Manitoba, though, particularly in southern Manitoba, where harvest tends to start earlier in the season, we've still got relatively long days, warm days. Glyphosate can facilitate harvest and dry down that stock material. The amount of time it's going to take is extremely variable, just like swathing is, could be 7 up to 3 weeks later. The timing, 50 to 60% seed color change, so kind of your normal swath timing. I don't know if you've looked at the label, but it says 30%, less than 30% moisture, pods are green to yellow, and most seeds are yellow to brown. I wish they would change this. We always are telling people you can't stage your crop by looking at the outside of the pods or what the plant looks like. You need to actually look at the seeds. So I would just completely disregard that, but it is, the 30% moisture, of course, does apply. But what does less than 30% moisture actually look like? It's a little bit easier to stage that in cereals, I think, than in canola. But we use a seed color change to kind of try and correlate to that moisture content. And to be safe, we recommend 50 to 60% seed color change. If the least mature areas of the field are at that point, then we can feel pretty confident that we're well below that 30% moisture. So we've got some good resources at Canola Watch and at our canolacouncil.org that can help you kind of determine what that main stem should look like. These are some good visuals right here. But basically, you want to split that main stem into thirds and check the seeds on each third, and you should be seeing kind of a gradient from very dark brown to black up to green at the top, but of course firm to roll. Generally, kind of a rule is we see an increase of 10% seed color change every 2 to 3 days. You probably all noticed a fairly big campaign on getting our timing right for glyphosate. I mean, we all know that this is a safe and effective product, but there's a pile of public scrutiny on glyphosate right now. So I think now more than ever, it's really important that we steward this product properly and make sure that we aren't applying it too early and we're not having residue issues on the seed. Not only public scrutiny, trade relations aren't exactly easy right now, and I would say that it's almost like people are looking for a reason to create trade disruptions, so we don't want to give them one. So I'd really just encourage people to make sure that the least mature areas of their field are in stage for applying glyphosate, and that's probably going to mean that the more mature areas are past stage, but that's not an issue for applying glyphosate. With that said, glyphosate of the 3 products can be maybe a better option for managing some variance in maturity because it has the earliest application timing of the 3 products, and it's more slow acting systemic product. So, not likely to see any quality implications if we're at 50% seed color change on one part of the field and completely mature in other parts of the field, that's not going to be an issue. So just a couple more things here when we're looking specifically to straight cutting is when can we get into that crop? I think I've seen the last few years where, there's some instances where people maybe could have started a little bit earlier, but we're waiting for more dry down. So of course we're targeting 10% seed moisture for harvest or less, but that's not the only thing that we can kind of use to time when we should be starting straight cutting. So, do we look at seed dry down, pod dry down, or stem dry down? And I would suggest that pod dry down is kind of the compromise between the two for straight cutting. If we're waiting to see stem dry down equivalent to that of what we've grown accustomed to with a swath crop, it's going to take a really, really long time, and it may be next spring before we see that. So to wait until we see that those pods are no longer green at all and no longer rubbery is kind of the compromise in between. And then, we can cut high and increase capacity of our machine and not put that, try and put as little of that green stalk material through as possible. Another nice thing about straight cutting when there is green stalk material there is we don't get nearly as much material breakup and we don't overload the shoe like we tend to do when we're picking up a swath crop that's really cured. So I just had these pictures up here because you can see this was on my own farm, so I know what the seed moisture of it was. It was over 8%, but theoretically ready to go. But you can see how much green pod material there is there, and basically a lot of that just gets spit out intact, and you've got rotor losses that are really hard to correct for without over threshing the rest of the crop. So again, kind of on the same theme of, maybe we can get into the crop sooner. This was an example of a reseed scenario. You can probably see the line in the stubble there. So the right-hand side was seeded May 5th and the left-hand side was seeded May 27th, and actually just harvested them all on the same day. Now, the later stuff was much harder going, a lot slower going, probably could have used a few more days. But I think the point of showing this is there's maybe an opportunity to go sooner than we really realize, and in some cases, particularly in Saskatchewan and Alberta last year, they were maybe waiting on a crop that could have been combined, and it ended up getting a foot of snow on it and became a real challenge after when it was laying flat on the ground. So I would just encourage people, if you are straight cutting, give it a try. These combines have humongous capacity, and I know they can put this material through. It does mean slowing down, but the beauty of that is we shouldn't have as high losses as we can if we're flying through a really cured crop. So I guess when we are dealing with variations in maturity, there's lots of different ways we can try and manage it, and likely for every farm that's going to be different, and it might mean a combination of all these things, a combination of different products, letting some just stand to naturally ripen, using a pre-harvest aid or swathing some, and really I know a lot of us are kind of done with the swather and rather would just keep it parked. But some of the extreme variance in maturity is probably best still managed with the swather. So just about done here. Lionel, you're probably wondering when I'm going to wrap up, but I do just want to plug two more things. I probably should have mentioned this when we talked about some of the insects, but we're getting pretty late in the season here, and if you are considering any pesticide applications, we need to be really careful with pre-harvest intervals. So I'd encourage you to use our spray to swath calculator. You can spray to swath.ca and make sure that the products you're using would be within the appropriate timeline from application to cutting of that crop. This Keeping It Clean campaign is a kind of a joint initiative between canola, cereals, and pulses. So there's not just canola information on there, there's information for those other crops as well. Also, really want to encourage people to make sure they're prepared to check and reduce their harvest losses this fall. There's some things we can do right now to get ready for that, getting some material together for a pan and, you know, maybe a little scale or a graduated cylinder. Harvest losses can be really, really high in canola, and you know, there's an opportunity to gain some yield without really any investment. So make sure that we're doing that this fall. We've got a short video here, just over 3 minutes long on YouTube, that can kind of explain this process if you're not familiar with it. We also have a combine optimization tool. You know, once you've gone through that process and you've seen what your losses are, then you need to make some changes with the combine settings. This will help you go through that. So it's kind of a step-by-step process. You can, you know, pick what the issue is, and it'll keep guiding you through different questions to try and narrow down what problem you're having. This can be found at canolacalculator.ca. So that's all that I had here this morning. Lionel may have some questions, or if any of the listeners have questions, please go ahead. But I do just want to wish everybody the best of luck with harvest this season.
Okay, great, Angela. There is a couple questions. One about the club root. I noticed on the map there that the southern part of Saskatchewan was fairly clean. Is that just because of low testing, or just it seems like it's stretching from Alberta and kind of northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba? We're kind of all over the place. So is that just because of testing in the different provinces, or is it kind of maybe a way it's moving?
Well, so last year was the first year they did a really extensive testing across Saskatchewan, but it was actually only concentrated in the north. So those white areas on the Saskatchewan map have not been tested. I know this year, though, they are moving those testing areas south. So I'm pretty confident that we'll see more areas on that map that have club root next year. And that's why we just really got to be careful when we look at these maps. They can be a little bit deceiving.
Okay, and a question that came in is, how effective is heat alone, not tank mixed with glyphosate, just heat alone?
So, you know, for those folks, I think that have glyphosate tolerant canola, that may be something that they would look to. BASF really positions heat with glyphosate, and it certainly does increase its efficacy. To be honest with you, I haven't seen a pile of it on its own, so I should be careful drawing too many conclusions. But again, I would say that it is better when it's with glyphosate, and you know, just going to kind of sharpen glyphosate.
Okay, and another question, is there any merit to swathing pod shatter canola too early and pods falling off plants?
I don't know if I understand the question.
Wondering if you swath it too early, will the pods fall?
I don't think so, Lionel. I've never seen an issue with that before. I think, you know, when we look at pod drop versus pod shatter, they're actually two different mechanisms. So the pod shatter is more, you know, the degree of pod shatter is more in genetic control than pod drop is. Pod drop is more of an environmental thing. So when it, you know, actually when the pedicel releases from the plant, that's not as much in genetic control, if that makes sense. So if there's an issue with pod drop, it's more likely because of environmental conditions or disease or insect or something, or, hail, something like that. But I would not suggest that it's from, an early swath. With that said, this is maybe not related to the question, but certainly would encourage people not to early swath on, particularly with pod shatter tolerance. Really, we're wasting those genetics if we swath way too early and going to see potential yield losses. The only thing, sorry, this is fairly long-winded, but the only thing that I do caution with really late swathing is we've now got a fairly fluffy crop that's pretty hard to roll and anchor, and then we're exposed to those swaths rolling. So it's a balance for sure.
Okay, and I got a question regarding the pod shatter too, and this is one that I guess happened a couple of years ago, and with the temperatures the way they are, and just wondering if what would be your opinion of frost and pod shatter? If we were to get an early frost, how well are the pod shatter varieties for holding on after a frost?
Sure. So as far as like the seeds themselves, there's no difference between the pod shatter versus your conventional varieties. If they're high moisture, they're going to be impacted just the same way. So if they're over 20% moisture, you're going to see issues. I think probably more what you're referring to is, are you going to see lose integrity of the pod and see shattering? Of course, you're not going to get any guarantee from the seed companies, and there's good reason for that. There's a lot of variation in frost and the severity of it, and it kind of depends when it happens. But I've certainly heard enough and seen enough to believe that there is more tolerance of those pod shatter tolerant varieties to things like frost events, where they're going to hold on to their pods better than a non-pod shatter tolerant variety. Similar in the cases of hail.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions we have right now, Angela. Thanks again for coming on and giving us an update on I guess the canola crop across the prairies, as well as some info on diseases and harvesting here. So thanks again for coming on and making time for us.
Thanks, Lionel. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll continue on with a little bit of a crop update as to what's been kind of going on in the past, I guess, few days out in the field. And I guess we're going to start off, I guess, just with Angela had mentioned a bit about some of the dry conditions in some of the areas, and this is what we're seeing in some of the areas now as the crop starts to mature and the pods start to fill. We start seeing, where maybe some of these heat issues and drought stress issues were showing up in some of the canola crop, and this slide is a good example. I got this picture yesterday showing some of the canola pods, the later ones, anyways, flowers aborting during that last heat before we received this last little bit of rainfall. So just one of the things we're seeing in the field as the crop starts to mature. Looking at our weather report for the last week and for the season, again, you're looking at not a lot of change from last week, besides the fact we got some rain in the southwest here. There was pretty good amounts in a lot of areas. Still some areas though that have been kind of on the dry cycle all year, still not receiving as much as some of the other areas, and you can definitely see that in some of the crops, especially when you get a little bit north of that Manitoba area, north of 16 Highway towards and east and the eastern side of the province especially. So those areas definitely lacking moisture. Just a little bit more on some of the crop as it was out there, and I guess about a week ago, I got this picture of some fusarium showing up in some. This was a volunteer plant actually that was in a field of wheat, and it definitely had a fair bit of fusarium. But when you look at just the overall general cropping for the province right now, we are into harvest. There's several areas that have been combining. I think for the majority, a lot of the areas have been into winter wheat and fall rye. Winter wheat and fall rye right now, from most of the reports throughout the province, we're seeing probably an average yield, maybe a little bit below average in some areas, and probably due to the cool, dry conditions. Quality looks to be fairly good so far. When you look at the southwest and northwest and eastern and interlake areas, we have producers in those areas that are starting on peas. Peas have been sprayed in a lot of instances to get them to ripen in, but that harvest is probably only about 20% complete right now. Right now we're looking at fairly good yields and fairly good quality. When you get into the central region of the province and the Red River Valley area, that's when you see a lot more harvest being done, and everything from cereals to canola to peas being done in those areas. And right now, that area, some of those areas that are getting a lot of the harvest done did experience some of the drier conditions as well during the year, and we're seeing anything from average to slightly below average for some of those areas. I think it's going to depend a lot from when you did receive the rainfall in those areas and how much rain you got. So variable yields so far on most of the spring seeded cereals and canola that has been harvested. But again, those amounts that have been done are fairly low. I mentioned about peas that they're being harvested in most areas, and one of the things and one of the questions we've been getting a bit on peas is that some of the crop doesn't seem to want to die off. It seems to be throwing out new pods that and greening up, maybe even in some areas on top again. And that's probably due to some of the rainfall events we've had over the last week to 10 days. And we're also seeing some resurgence in weeds in those areas as well. And so for some of those areas that hadn't been sprayed yet, definitely will be needed to be sprayed to bring those crops in. Most of the fields where I've seen a pre-harvest application done, most of those fields are dried up, and right now I think most producers are just waiting for the soil conditions to get right to get in there and to harvest. Soybeans, probably one of the crops that benefited the most from the recent rain we got. They're in the late R5 stage to the R6 pod filling stage, and I think the rain will definitely help those pods fill. I think one of the things we are seeing this year is, or what I've been seeing anyways on this side of the province, is that we're seeing a lot of 3s and 4s in the pods, not a lot of we might have seen maybe some larger pods, but I think what might have happened is because of the dry conditions, we might have seen some of those seeds aborting and not actually continuing on to maturity. So I think the rain is going to help fill the pods and hopefully bring us into an average yield situation, and hopefully another rainfall later on here will help finish them off. Corn is another crop. Corn and sunflowers, I guess, are two of the other crops that are going to benefit a lot, or a fair bit, from the rain. I think with both those crops, I think guys are hoping they would grow a little faster and get into more of the filling stage. I think a lot of the corn is, depending on what side of the province you're on, the southern side, the cobs are starting to fill out and produce good seed already. Northern side, we're still seeing a fair bit of early cob development, and I think still needs a fair bit of time for that cob to fill seed and get going. So I think in the back of everybody's mind is when we start seeing some of these cool days is hopefully not for an early frost, but from looking at forecasts, we might have got through that stage of the cool weather, and we might be in a stretch here of some decent weather. One of the other things I've been getting some questions on is a bit about aphids. We're seeing this picture was taken in the south of Souris area, where oat field had several aphids on the panicles of the oats, especially even on where they're attached to the panicle. The oat seed attaches to the panicle. There was a lot of aphids right through the head and everything. It wasn't on every plant, but there was definitely plants there that it was you noticed them there. And again, numbers were high on some plants, but nothing where it would warrant any type of spraying. When I was out in the field, we were seeing a ladybug larvae that were feeding on the aphids, and that's a good thing. And just put this up just so everybody can identify with when you're getting out in the field and seeing them. You'll probably see a lot of the larvae right now that are feeding on aphids, and they look almost like an ancient reptile almost when you look at them, but they're definitely a beneficial out there, and have lots of aphids to feed off of. With that, there's a couple more slides I wanted to bring out here. Again, the seasonal crop reports. They're continuing, especially the insect, weeds, and disease updates. Weather maps are always there, so definitely go to our website for that type of information. Also, on our website, there's the hay listings, Manitoba hay listings that are there. So if you have hay for sale or straw for sale, or willing to drop some straw for producers in the province that are lacking some feed, definitely go to that website where you can enter your information as to, or there's information as to how to enter what you have for sale on there. Also, there is a couple more things on our website regarding managing low forage supplies during the winter. I think it's a really good Excel file where you go through and you put in your feed that you have and what you're able to get your hands on, and it kind of lets you know as to the amount of livestock you're able to feed with that, and kind of gives you a heads up as to where you'll land up through the winter, especially in a situation where you're low on feed or having to buy feed. So definitely go to the website there. There's some really good information on that. Adding on to that, if you have concerns regarding hay or shortage of feed, definitely contact any of the crop production extension people in the province as well. If you have something else happening in your field, if you're looking and doing some scouting of your canola and you're seeing some things that you might think are clubroot, definitely give us a call, and we'd love to come out and see if there's see what's in the field. So give these people a call. And I guess that's it for today. So join us next week, August the 21st, for the next edition of CropTalk. Thanks for attending.